Okay, Matt, if you would like to go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. I'm Matt Haynes. I'm a graduate student in the poetry program. Some of you, of course, know. And we're fortunate today to have Dan Beachy-Quick. Many of you have probably been reading his work recently or in the past. For those of you who are less familiar, he's written in many genres. He's written novels, books of essays, most recently A Brighter Word Than Bright on John Keats. He's written collaborative books as well as intertextual books that work in dialogue with Melville. In one case, he wrote a book called A Whaler's Dictionary. He also wrote a book about Marcel Proust, who was also collaborative. But of course, he's written many volumes of poetry, most recently Circle's Apprentice. And so we're fortunate to have him here. And I'll lead off with an opening question, but of course, the room will be open to anyone who has questions. So without further ado, welcome Dan Beachy-Quick.
I don't feel comfortable behind the... I haven't gotten there yet, maybe one day.
Okay, so in my little spiel there, I mentioned that some of your books are what we might think of as intertextual, working in dialogue with other texts, as I mentioned, Melville and Proust. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the importance of reading in relationship to your process as a writer, and how you understand the importance of that dialogue and maybe a sense of continuity with the past in what you write.
Yeah, oh, thanks. It's a great question, and one I hope everyone can hear me without a thing on my body amplifying my voice called a microphone. You all can hear me all right? Okay. If I start mumbling or whispering or like talking just to myself somehow, let me know. Break the reverie before it gets overly awkward. Emerson has this lovely, lovely moment in The American Scholar where he says, if there is such a thing as creative writing, there is such a thing as creative reading. And it's a kind of tenet that I've taken very, very seriously. I felt in some ways that the most meaningful experiences I've had as a poet haven't come from writing poems as much as they've come from reading poems, reading books, reading others that, as Thoreau might put it, left me asking a question I didn't know I could ask. And that's a really addictive and humbling kind of activity. It sort of initiates you into your artistic and intellectual and emotional life in a way where you don't get to walk away feeling proud at having gained a meaning or smarter for having learned a fact, but you walk away in some sense more honestly humbled, because more genuinely bewildered, as if you've been introduced into the complexity of yourself and the complexity of the world and yourself in the world in a way you never could have accomplished without that book. And that sense of not being alone in the midst of difficulty is one of the extraordinary gifts, I think, that art of almost any kind offers us. And so, I began to suspect certain things. I don't know if I've ever reached knowing anything yet in my life. I don't especially plan on it, but I suspect lots of things. And one of those is that, and I tell it to students often, is you can't write better than you can read. Like, if you want to write a poem that affects people, the only way you can manage that is if you can read a poem so that it affects yourself. Like, that sets the bar of your creative possibilities. And when we begin to think of creativity as something different than simply an expressive or an imaginative outpouring, and we begin to understand something Keats asks us to take very seriously, that there's a creative passivity, a creative receptiveness, and that in learning how to read, this kind of ongoing life study of what it is to read as fully as you can read, you're engaging this receptive quality of where creativity has perhaps its deepest home, the inverse of which, by accident or by intent, it hardly matters, is that the poem comes out as words of your own, or almost your own. I don't actually know what it is to have words that are your own. None of them are our own. If we had our own words, we would make sense to no one. We have this shared thing. We've had it for centuries. We've had it for millennia, this language. And of course, reading creatively is an introduction to that. And that sense of history, we have this extraordinary form of time travel in books in which that which is gone, which is absent, which is dead, which should be silent by any normal measure of the reality of life, is by this strange technology of the word available for you to read in such a way that it is as alive in your mind, in your mouth, in your ear, as it was when Melville, Dickinson, Emerson, Sappho, Donne, Herbert wrote them. And one of the great aspects of creative reading, why it's like a thing that almost has its secret heart life inside of academia, and you don't want academia to know it too fully, is that you read to keep alive these people and these books, these voices, these thoughts, and without your attending to them as a kind of life, they won't live.
I just asked a little more specifically. In your Keats book, it's clear that you delve into the poetry, but the letters as well, but also like the places that Keats has visited. In terms of creative reading, is there anything you can point to in terms of how that's affected your own work? Anything along those lines?
Well, if you have whatever fortune or misfortune to read my critical books, my book on Melville, my book on Keats. I say that jokingly. I mean, I hope you would. But it will read, I think, somewhat different than a kind of typical academic text. And maybe it's easier to kind of demonstrate what difference creative reading might be by talking about a Whaler's Dictionary, which was the first time I had really tried to write about another piece of literature in an extended way. And it's a book that rattled me, riddled me, changed my life almost completely. Every question I've ever had about the nature of what writing is or art is, I've asked in some way because Moby Dick has forced me to ask it. It was there. It's that kind of seminal text for me. Seminal seems the right word for a book about the sperm whale. And what I wanted to do was something that I feel like Melville encourages us, both biographically but creatively, which is that if you want to become a reader, in some ways you have to become a whaler. Like the way in which those middle chapters that everyone kind of hates at some times act is that they're strangely initiating us into the language that marks the possibility of experiencing as those whalers experience. You get footnotes, you get language, you get a means, an understanding, a techne, a possibility of how to act in a situation that's typically far outside of what our normal resources would be. So in some sense, if you're going to read Melville by his own light, rather than finding some critical distance against which or from which to make an argument about the book that any other reasonably intelligent person could do, you have to find your way into the squall of the thinking. You have to near the beast of the thing, where the danger of thinking occludes the possibility of clear judgment. You have to be in the thinking rather than think about the thinking. And so I wrote a book. I just decided I was going to write every single thought I've ever had about this book. I mean, you should talk to my wife about it. She will just walk out the door, actually. It's like, I thought I was going to have to divorce you. It's like, I know. I wanted to divorce myself. But apparently that's hard. I filed a petition for irreconcilable differences with myself, and the judge was like, Everyone has that. And the judge was Melville. It was just a dream. And so, I wanted to create something that it in itself enacted the kind of thinking it was trying to do. And so there's a dictionary modeled on the 32nd chapter of Moby Dick, or he's trying to write this encyclopedia of the whales. But the very nature of the whale is that it dives down. The nature of its livingness is outside the possibility of real witness. And the only way you gain accuracy is by killing it. Something that seems a dangerous parallel at times to the nature of, say, academic life. And so it's this marvelously failed thing, and I wanted to write a marvelously failed book about a marvelously failed thing. And so I wrote a dictionary. It has alphabetized entries. You're never supposed to read the book from A to Z. You're supposed to open it wherever you do. You get to the bottom of a chapter, and there's a series of cross-references, and you pick one, and you go to that, and again, and you can make whole circuits. And every time you pick up the book, you find yourself charting a different path of possible meaning-making through what Moby Dick is as a whaler's dictionary is trying to think about it. And, of course, this feels absolutely truer to me, that we go back over and over again to those books that, for whatever reason, have their grappling hooks in us, because each time we read them, they mean for us differently. And I wanted a book that somehow honored that wasn't caring about a totality of experience, a totality of thought, that was riddled with gaps, erasures, oddities, because that feels to me like what actual thinking exposes us to. And the Keats is in many ways the same, but it gets to hide under a kind of greater coherence. I mean, one of the great lessons in Keats's letters, Don Revelle, a mentor of mine, said it's the document of soul-making in the English language. One of the things you see is that he thinks and obsesses over and over again about the very same points. And in this brief life, 1816 to 1821, in which he's really writing these 5 years, he goes back and changes and alters and suffers the consequences of what one thought is as it turns into another. And so I wrote a book that's returning over and over and over again across those years of his deepest imaginative and creative life, showing what that mutation is, not trying to judge it, not trying to make a claim about it, just entering into it, suffering it with him. Because in some sense, I feel like that's what literature, art asks us to do. It asks you to suffer the thing too, and that's not, it sounds dismal, but it's a work that teaches you what sympathy and an ethical life might look like. And it doesn't look neat. It looks messy.
I'm not sure that there's a lot maybe to talk about here, but I'm curious because I'm taking a research and bibliography class. We're talking a lot about notes in the margin of the text. Oh, you can say, I can stand.
Oh, no. It seems so rude not to see you, though.
Margin of the text, and I'm wondering, I'm just sort of curious about how you read it. Are you a page folder? Are you writing in the margins? And then also, do any of your poems or have any of your collections emerge out of some kind of intertextuality with some kind of, your interpretation of how somebody else is reading this text and the marks they've made?
I have often been deeply attracted towards reading someone else's reading, but haven't created work of that nature directly. I mean, there is a kind of reading of Shakespeare that one can't help but do by reading Melville. And that's just there no matter what. Ahab's Lear-like demonic urge is one of the multiple masks which Ahab wears and Melville wears too. A mask whose familiarity is its strangeness in the weird way such things might work. As for my own process, I write in margins, I take notes, I kind of obsessively return to passages. I sort of pay attention to what I can't stop thinking about and go back to those things. I reread a lot. But when I'm really, like, when I go to the Keats, or when I was writing the Keats book, when I was writing the Melville book, I don't go to notes at all. I just go back to the book, always. And I'm a real sucker for primary texts and just putting myself in relation to them as best I can.
I read Word from Memory over the summer, and I was wondering if you could talk about like your collaboration process and
Yeah.
how you go about that.
So this is a book that a colleague and friend and I wrote on just 3 different areas in Proust. One, we began with the idea of the fugitive. What is fugitive? And then we looked at the infamous long sentence. And then thought about sleep, and through sleep forgetting. And what happened was I had been teaching at the School of the Art Institute. I had this wonderful colleague there who's a performance artist primarily, a man named Matthew Goulash, who he said that he knew he had become a performance artist when he was doing stand-up improv with Second City, like where, the Second City troupe, and that people just stopped laughing. And then he was like, and then I knew I became a performance artist. So if you ever wonder about, like, if you're wondering deep in your heart if you're a performance artist, if you're trying to make people laugh and they don't, you might be a performance artist. Which I try to remember myself when I'm teaching. There's always performance art for me, even now. And what we were going to do was we were going to teach, and you can only do this, I think, at like a school run by artists. We were going to teach a year-long collaborative course on the entirety of In Remembrance of Things Past. It's an absurd idea. And then I got this job at Colorado State, and we were really bummed out about it. So we decided to just do this back and forth. And he's very into procedural processes in terms of how he creates performances and essays that he writes. And so we made this kind of template, and we had one idea we wrote without looking at what the other person was doing, and then we, like, 3 years later, got to the end of this thing and looked at it, and it seemed interesting and weird, and a kind of conversation happening both as it must and against all odds at the same time. Other collaborations I've done have been totally different, as I think, like, probably every collaborative project has to find its own vital principle in a way. Collaboration doesn't, I think, like senseless repetition. Yeah. But that's where that came from. Mm-hmm.
You said that when you're reading, you reread and you go back to things you can't stop thinking about. As a writer, as a poet, do you have things that come into your head or even into your writing and you can't stop, the reoccurring themes? What do you do when you reach those points?
Well, you will be witness to some of those if you come into the reading, and you'll be like, Beachy-Quick, get over it. Which is what I think many people should say to me, really, because saying it to myself seems to lack potency. You know what? I've come to really trust that. Like, I'm adverse to the kind of advice that promotes you to have as many varied things entering into your poems, like to make each one different. Like, each poem is trying to find a nuance of something that is perhaps of utmost concern for you, and you don't know why it is. And in some ways, if you don't give your poems over to their own particular obsessions, in some odd kind of way, you're in denial of genius. And genius here is not that thing that, someone has an IQ so high, it's, she's or he's like in another intellectual sphere than you. Genius is this old thing that's what Emerson says is in common. It's this thing somehow of you, in you, wholly outside of you, guardian of you, thruster into danger of you, who gives to you these things that you're not wholly in control of. And if you feel like I've written too many poems about whatever, then you're in some ways, biting the hand that feeds you. And like, if those poems aren't working, if the obsession isn't of use, you'll know it eventually. Like, those poems won't continue to live for you. You'll walk away from them. But to feel as if you have to step out of a concern just because you've spent 2 or 3 years writing about it, I think is really to give over to a false pressure. And maybe a real bad one for your like deepest creative self. But if you're like writing like 1,000 poems about Big Bird or something, maybe like tell me that later, and I'll say we'll find ways to like move you on to like something else. Maybe you've covered it, yeah. But I don't think you're talking about useless obsessions.
So I was reading recently. It was a couple of years ago, a sort of online forum you participated in, Boston Review. Marjorie Perloff sort of set the tone for it about reinventing the lyric, and wrote an essay, and then you contributed an essay. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you understand the lyric poem in today's, I guess, climate poetry world. Your work often is characterized as lyric, but obviously is deviating in many ways and taking many, bringing in other techniques and methods. So if you had any thoughts about that in general.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it was slightly ironic that I was asked to do that because in some ways, like, it's not an argument I particularly cared about in any way, like this whole tired conversation between what the experimental is and what tradition is, and all of that strikes me as not worthy of obsession in some way. But what did feel valid to me is, I get the sense still, and it's hard to believe that still a sense one gets, that there's some gulf between what a traditional poetics might be and the kind of figures and tropes that mark a certain kind of poetry as traditional, be it meter, be it rhyme, be it operating in inherited form, against a kind of experimental poetics that's, troubled with the nature of signifier and signified, with ideologies, with all of those things, all of which feel very important to me and not mutually exclusive to one another. And one of the things that feels powerful to me in really considering whether one might be a lyric poet, and I've come to think that basically what I am is a lyric poet, is the history of what the lyre as an instrument is. Because the story of that instrument that Apollo plays and creates these songs that are themselves a form of prophecy, and because they're prophecy from Apollo, they are themselves a form of light. But that instrument was made by Hermes when he was 1 day old, and a turtle walks into his cave where he's living with his mother, and he resents as a baby being in a cave. He's a child of Zeus, for goodness sake. And he looks at this turtle and coaxes it to it, turns it over, kills it, scoops out its inside, strings the strings of the lyre across it, plucks it, and hears that the tune is good. And right upon then realizes that Apollo has these cattle that he doesn't share with anyone. And he's like, that's screwed up. I'm going to go get these cattle. He's 1 day old, And he comes up with this, like, elaborate ruse. He makes them walk backwards. He creates these shoes that erase his own footprints. Some, like, shocked shepherd watches it happening, and he's like, don't tell Apollo. And, like, if I do that and a baby says that to me, I'm like, look, buddy, all right. I will totally be quiet, because obviously that's not a normal baby. This guy wasn't that smart, sadly. But but Apollo comes, and well, before that, so Hermes, who is a child of Zeus, a child of a goddess, thinks he belongs in this pantheon of the immortals, that he shouldn't be in this degraded state. And so he butchers one of these cattle, and he starts to put it on the fire as an offering. And he sings a threnody. He sings a song about all of the gods and includes himself in it. And though he smells this and he wants to be weaned, 1 day old, he wants to eat of this meat, he won't let himself. He denies himself his appetite, and by doing so, tricks himself up into a sphere of divinity that he had been denied. Apollo finds him, is hugely angry, is about to throw him down a pit to Tartarus, because the insolent beast of this baby is lying still. He's like, I know you've done it. You smell like a burned cow. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I drink my mother's milk. I'm 1 day old. And finally, Zeus comes down and remedies it. But all of this is to say that within lyric tradition is no mere behavior according to the tenets of authority and hierarchy that tell you this is as it should be. It's exactly the opposite. That lyric tradition has in it some root experience that wants to tear itself up to examine what it is. And that feels important to me. To understand that tradition and experiment are the same point. And we have to understand how to go back to things that we want to perhaps dismiss as creatively trite or cliched or rote or quiet or easy or unambitious, and realize that we have to use those tools to make a poetry that is valid now.
As a member of the Turtle Advocacy Union, I'm deeply offended by that. Just want to say, no. I want you actually to talk a little bit about obsession and relate it to process, because it seems to me that word can mean many different things.
Yeah.
And in one sense, it might narrow our field of vision such that our process, which in poetry has to be dialectical, actually goes farther in a way that it wouldn't if we didn't have these boundaries. Mm-hmm. And that maybe a more useful distinction in terms of different kinds of poetics, as opposed to the experimental and traditional, which we're all kind of tired of, would be one that is devoted to a kind of progressive unfolding and an exploration of thought versus a field wherein, connections are very, very loose. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think it's beautifully put.
Nevertheless, be experimental, but there are forms of experiment that are associated with vision that commit very little in terms of this dialectical going in. Does this make sense?
Yeah. I'd agree wholly. I mean, that sense of... And obsession is a dangerous word, and maybe we should kind of articulate that in a more thoughtful way, because there's a certain kind of obsessiveness that is, a real damage to the psyche that has to bear its burden. And one of the markers, I think, of such obsession is that it somehow denies the ability to do the work that might unfold it in the engaged way that Bruce was just talking about for us. There's something about an obsession that forces you back to the work, back to the field that, as Duncan might say, that one finds oneself permitted to return to, the made thing of the field. And it's such an important thing when he says that made thing, and often I am permitted to return to a meadow. And I think this goes much towards what you're saying. The very word in Greek, poesis, simply means, not just poet, but maker, or it means maker even before it means poet. The verb that derives out of that noun, poeo, means to do, to make. The middle voice of that word, oddly and beautifully, the middle voice in Greek is when the verb you perform upon yourself. The middle voice of to do, to make, which it relates to poetry, is to consider. And one of the real, I think, markers of an engaged poetry that's trying to unfold its possibilities to the fullest degree it knows how to do, and you happen to be the vessel of that work, is that you find in a strange kind of way that the poem you write has reached a consideration of itself, which might be, in a weird way, more powerful a lesson about the nature of poetry than you're being able to consider it, as if you're eavesdropping on what the poem has, by being written, discovered can be written. And that feels to me like a place in which, that whole garbage of experiment and tradition is lost, because one is just in some fundamental way trying to be at work in the field. And the field's a made thing, and you're a maker in it. And the nature of that making is that it considers itself. Does that answer that? Or
it was very cool. I'm not sure it does, but it's very cool. Okay, take poesis and relate it to this idea of following through on an idea, as opposed to skipping. We probably are aware of the Hoagland essay about the skittery poem, and that's one way of looking at it in a simple sense. But one thing that obsession is often associated with pathology and therefore getting stuck. Like you have a repetition, a compulsion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But it might also be associated with a form of progress that's only possible via narrowing our field of vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's a deepening. Inevitably, if you, in a superficial way, you may write the poem about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of deep structure, you can't make it a good
No.
poem. It has to go forward.
Yeah, it has to deepen itself. Yeah.
But you're going to a place that you can't get to without some sense of focus and abiding, return.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree wholly. Yep. Yeah, a lot of things that look the same dig deeper.
But then I like relating that to poesis, because part of what you're making is process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
As a jack of all trades, it seems with novels, poetry, collaboration, potential artifact, and all this is fantastic. How do you feel about the nature of labels, pigeonholing? I think, did you say earlier you consider yourself a nature writer? Did I hear that? Or not so much?
I think that's from maybe a previous conversation. But, I mean, I do. But I should, foreground that by, I don't know what it is. I don't know what else a writer can be in some, basic way. In some sense, because we only have the world to imagine the world. And that particular, phenomenological limit means that, in some sense, whatever it is you think you're doing, you're also simultaneously a nature poet. And it's easy, I think, to think that language is something that's removed itself from nature. But that's also, I think, to make some assumptions about what reality is in the largest way that we should probably be somewhat frightened to easily make. As to pigeonholing, I don't know. It doesn't bug me. I don't care about it. I just think of myself as a poet, and in some ways I've written in other forms because I feel like I need to understand how words work as fully as I possibly can do. I want to feel how a sentence feels in ways that perhaps a line feels different. I want to know what it is to be in a fictive space versus to be in an essayistic one. I want to know the material that is my material, and I still don't feel wholly like I do.
Just from hearing you speak today and from looking at some of the things that you've written recently, you seem to be really well versed in a lot of different time periods and the literature within those time periods. For example, your recent foretelling of a mythological story versus like delving into Keats. So was there another time period that you are interested in kind of analyzing the literature from that we might be able to see from you in the future? Sorry, I don't know how to articulate that question, but
well, I don't foresee any kind of like critical essay thing happening for a while. I think I'm like most writers, and it's just like you have this sort of weird, idiosyncratic, blissful net of things that connect just because you desire them to connect at some level, and sometimes those connections end up real. And so I mean, currently I'm very, very much immersed in ancient Greek literature and ancient Roman literature written in Greek, and I'm trying to teach myself Greek, which has really diminished my social ability in all sorts of troubling ways. And the poems you'll hear tonight, some of them bear quite deeply the obsessive unfolding of this particular concern of mine, to put it in this apt language we've been given. But I don't plan on doing, I don't work by having plans at all. So who knows?
I haven't fully formulated the question, but in going forward in writing, when you're looking at the blank paper or whatever, blank screen.
Yeah, sad, isn't it?
Is the approach, I'm going to write something, poem, for example, I'm going to write the poem that hasn't been written yet, or I'm going to put an idea here down that has yet to been thought up yet? Or do you try and go back and rewrite something that's already been written and write it better? Like, are you thinking of something new that hasn't been done before, or do you approach it as I'm going to do something that's already been done before?
Well, that's a great question, and a really hard question in many ways, I think, which makes me wonder what your fully thought-out questions are like. That was because that seemed pretty fully thought out to me.
It was happening as I was.
Makes you, yeah, that's a gift. I don't know what a new poem is. I don't know what a new thought is. I don't feel overly convinced that such things are possible in a certain way. Like, part of me, and maybe it's not the best part of me, thinks, well, every great poem that might have to be written might be written. We might not need another great poem. We might not need another thought, but I don't even wholly know what thinking is at some level. But that a new thought, I don't know what a new thought is at all. All of this is to say that even if everything was somehow like a filled plenum, like the page was already full with every possibility, there's some like requirement still in us, some sense of possibility, some way in which we have to articulate for ourselves, as ourselves, the very same thoughts, feelings, experiences that have been the common currency of human life since human life began. I don't feel like we've gained some grand perspective on anything. I think the human condition is remarkably, perniciously persistent. And that what we feel, what we care about, what we carry in us, what we carry on us, the burdens we have, the joys we have, they are remarkably similar to all those before us who've had nearly the same thing. And because of this, we also get to write poems, get to write them about what everyone's always written about. And that's powerful. It's genius in the way that we were talking about genius. Genius invites you to do the thing that's already been done, validates this completely absurd thing. I'll read a poem tonight that is a rewriting of a poem that should never be rewritten. But one does. Because, as Keats says, Socrates is nothing, or That's Thoreau. Thoreau says, Socrates is nothing to me until I've thought Socrates' thoughts. Keats says, a proverb must be proven on the pulse. And the only way we can do this is to write these poems again ourselves. Maybe. There's probably other ways, actually. Sorry. I get really, into something. I'm like, what a jerk you're being. There's lots of other ways, but this is the way I know how to do these things. Mm-hmm.
So in Circle's Apprentice, I'm interested in sort of the many recurring motifs in that book and the phenomenon of recurrence and circularity. But I wonder, so I guess I wonder if you could speak about what you think about the circle and circularity. And it begins with a quote from, is it Emerson's essay on circles?
Yes.
Yeah, so how do you see that as an idea and as a phenomenon working through that book?
Well, I might want to just, for a bit, just talk about that quote with which the book opens and from which the book gains its title, Circle's Apprentice, where Emerson in Circle says, we spend our lives apprenticed to the fact that around every circle, another circle can be drawn. And in some odd kind of way, I suspect there's a connection back to the earlier conversation about obsessiveness that digs down, obsessiveness, oh man, that's a hard word, obsessiveness that kind of spreads across the breadth and depth of that kind of question, the texture that we were being given. And I'm going to try to get this, sorry, I'm so oblique today. It's not just today. Charles Olson in the Maximus poem says something, I think, really powerful. And he claims that every poem is the discovery of its own limit. And one of the things that I take from that quote of Emerson is that in some way he has this sense of almost universal structure, that the only way the circle around the other circle can be drawn is that the first circle to its utmost limit has been discovered. And the sense of both kind of rupture and rapture that are involved in that sense of Emerson's, of a kind of continuous furthering, continuous unfolding, that a book does its work when it so fills up the shape that it's made that the shape fails, and so the next book is required, feels to me like a particular model for the creative life I'd most like to live. Not one in which every book is a perfect thing, but that the nature of the book, it shows me, as Keats might say, the flaw in its happiness, and only through that flaw is the next book possible, and perhaps one might hope even required, because one wants to believe, I want to believe, that there's a certain necessity in what one does. And that sense of being apprenticed to the way in which around every circle, around every single shape you think you've accomplished in your life, you wake up to the realization, student once again, that around that shape there's a vaster shape you have to discover, is one that makes me feel horrified, inspired, fearful, audacious, all at the same time. And it's a good model, I think. I think Emerson is like, we should have tattoos of him. All of us. Everywhere. Sorry. All of a sudden I pictured what that looked like, and it was awful, actually. So that's one way I'm thinking about it.
There's construction going on above.
Oh, yes. Awesome. And in that book, it's thinking. It says each one is a kind of circle, moving from the songs, lullabies that put a child to sleep to a kind of last sleep, in which the nature of image as a tomb figuring is a thing that's put into this vast sleep, where in some ways all all you want is the thought that should you wake up, you'd be able to remember some relic of what your life had been by the thing that's kept there with you. And sometimes, like, poems feel that way to me. Like, they remind you that this thing once existed. And against, like, the awful blankness of margins and the awful blankness at the bottom of poems and the awful blankness of last pages, there's these images one holds on to, I think, more dearly than often we care to admit to ourselves, as if somehow in this word, in this image the word gives us, this thing that is real but not real, more than real, less than real, that one feels somehow a kind of desperate security for the ongoing value of what it is to be here among others in a world is there. And you remember it before you've lost it. And it's uncanny, it's paradoxical, it's strange, and it's right.
I'll only ask questions other people don't have one. That's a weird way of asking my question. Okay. I think it was simple, and I know this just in your last response, which was absolutely converting. You used the word thought and thinking several times. You've already talked about the sort of the end. One reason I like your work so much is that it's thoughtful and it thinks that it moves forward. It's deeply investigative. Your parable of this, or Emerson's, of the circle is also beautiful. But what it implies, you talked about bringing things together. That was your description of the process, and then suddenly there is a sense of more. That is neither thing in the equation, in the metaphor, in the association, whatever. Suddenly there's this birth of a new thing. So this is not rational thought. This is ontological description. Does that make sense? Which people call thought.
Mm-hmm.
It's like making a new language.
Yeah.
Something. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Using our given language to name something that has a name. Okay. That's a long preface to this other question. Does narrative play a role in the dialectic of your poem? I mean, how does narrative figure in conversation with argument and ontological history? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Does it have a role, or do you have an allergy to
No, not at all.
Operating in a very different way.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect that every poem that functions has embedded in it a narrative. Like, and it's just that term, I think, is too easily overtaken by a sense of the fictive, of plot. That's the thing that marks narrative. What I mean by narrative is perhaps looser and more within the kind, and I can't get over it actually, to describe thought as ontological description. That feels like absolutely right. Like that moment of description in which the thing is seen and must be described, or else it will never be seen as a thought. It like reminds us that, of course, thought begins in our perceptive lives. Like thought begins by trying to describe something to yourself, such as the nature of words, as you quickly learn as soon as you have kids, and how troubled they are when they don't know the right name for things. But what feels to me like a narrative life in a poem is that a poem has to have within it a kind of formal life, a formal logic. There has to be a species of consequence that necessitates one line dropping from another. And so by narrative, I might just simply suggest that in some poems, all the narrative is a traceable coherency that can be no other way. That, to me, feels like a narrative. No one else would call that a narrative poem necessarily, but when I see it, and when I'm like working with students, graduate students, some of whom value themselves primarily as a so-called experimental writer, like one has to like say, like, there's not a way in which this is falling out as a natural consequence of the earlier thing. There's no precedent. There's no antecedent. And until that happens, you're giving yourself over to a species of intellection that I really have grave doubts about. Like all of us in this room, and most in any room, are smart enough to think anything we think it is we want to think. And some of us are so good with words, so good with language, so good with whatever, that can stand as a species of thinking as a form of experience that it simply isn't when looked at as closely as you possibly can. And one way I might suggest you can see that difference is that poetry, which might look very similar to another kind of poetry, but one that has a narrative life, has a coherency that necessitates its utterance in a way that the other doesn't. And there's a hollowness there that I find devastating. If devastating could, if you can be devastated by things that cease to matter, that's how I feel devastated by those things.
Well, I hate to cut this off. I forgot I was supposed to be watching the time. I got so interested in what you were saying. Suddenly I'm thinking, oh, wait, let's bring this to an end. But thank you very much for this question and answer session. Want to give him as an added incentive, people who would like to continue this very stimulating conversation are welcome to meet up with us at Viet Bikes. We'll be happy, if Dan isn't completely worn out by this, to let you sit and chat a little bit more about whatever you want to. And then please join us again at 8 o'clock. Remember, in the Life Sciences building, which is just on the other side of, do they call that the administration building between here and there? Whatever that building is. In room A117. Okay, so we'll see you at 8 o'clock. And thank you again for joining us today, and thank you, Dan.